lads and lasses. Good to see you. Thanks for joining me for emotions. I labored about this for a few minutes, and here's the reason why. There's some controversy that isn't really getting talked about a lot. You know, it was kind of widely understood for a very long time that we have a basic premise of emotions, and that those basic emotions everybody has. And then Ekman comes along and, as a researcher, does a bunch of research, goes around the world, starts talking to people from different tribes, different cultures, and says we all have a universal nose for stink in order to be able to preserve ourselves from eating something really bad. Hygiene reasons are also mentioned by Paul Ekman. And then along comes this heretic, Lisa Feldman Barrett. And, it's fascinating because she talks about emotions, and she does it from a premise of what do we feel and where do we feel it. But she quotes a few people, particularly somebody you'll all have come across at least at some point in your travels, a guy named Charles Darwin. I'm reading from page 4. According to the classical view of emotion, our faces hold the key to assessing emotions objectively and accurately. The primary inspiration for this idea is Charles Darwin's book, quote, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, where he claimed that emotions and their expressions are an ancient part of universal human nature. All people everywhere in the world are said to exhibit and recognize facial expressions and emotion without any training whatsoever. So what you're going to find is that as we're going through this, there are going to be some challenges to things that we thought we already knew and we already understood. Now, I say that, and I had actually started out with a script. And my script starts out like this. In this look at emotion, it's a 3-part series. We're going to explore the origins, the seat, and the understanding of emotion, coupled with the actions that emotions evoke. We'll also explore how we understand and shape emotions, our interpretations and influences on emotions. Now, I mentioned I'm going to be using Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett's book. It's called How Emotions Are Made, The Secret Life of the Brain. I'm also going to be referring to The Emotional Brain, The Mysterious Underpinnings of Emotional Life by Dr. Joseph Ledoux, Dr. David Anderson's book, The Nature of the Beast, How Emotions Guide Us, the 1924 book, Applied Psychology by Dr. Ewer. And it made me think, what are you feeling right now? Right this minute. Do you notice anything in your body? Where? What does that feel like? Is there any discomfort in your body anywhere? Is your leg bouncing? Are your hands moving? Maybe they're doing something like this, pill rolling, or as my mom does, this. So pay attention to what you feel as a somatic or a sensation in the body. And I just want you to think about that for a minute. Now, we've been told that we feel things. The thing is, this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky, because we think we know exactly what emotions are. But we don't use emotion words. In fact, our society very recently seems to be moving more towards feeling words. There is a difference. But those feeling words really are adjectives, adverbs, nouns about what we're perceiving in that inner dialogue as it's doing an assessment of the body. Now, I'm going to go back to Lisa's book for just a minute here, because I want to get us all on the same page. It says, numerous experiments showed up that people feel depressed when they fail to live up to their own ideals, but when they fall short of a standard set by others, they feel anxious. And she goes on to talk about, she tried to replicate some of these experiments when she got to grad school, and it failed. She tried again over and over and over, each experiment taking months. After 3 years, I'd achieved the same failure 8 times in a row. In science, experiments often don't replicate, but 8 consecutive failures, impressive record. And so this is what I'm getting to. Many of my subjects appear to be unwilling or unable to distinguish between feeling anxious and feeling depressed. Now, every day in my practice as a marriage and family therapist, I sit with both individuals and couples and occasionally families who come in and they report, I don't feel good. I'm anxious. I'm depressed. But when I try to drill down on what does that mean, this is where it gets tricky, because it always devolves back to statements and declarations, sometimes whole paragraphs, about a perception or an event, and then trying to pull from that what is the underlying emotion. Now, throughout my training, both at University of Liverpool for forensic psychology, as well as my training here in the States to be a marriage and family therapist, I was taught that emotions are sadness, joy, contentment, excitement, fear, anger, sadness. Yeah, there are three others that often get, or two others that often get thrown into the mix, but these don't really go far enough to explain what's happening in the body, because, like I said, when I sit with people, the first thing that they tell me is, well, I've been feeling pretty anxious for a while. And if I drill down on that and say, well, tell me what that feels like, there's usually a story. Now, occasionally, I will have people who will say, I feel it right here. And they're pointing to their chest. 9 times out of 10, when people come in and they tell me they're feeling something high up in their chest, I also notice that their shoulders are up around their ears, their eyes are kind of wide, they're breathing not through their nose but through their mouth, and they're taking much shorter breaths. And when I ask them, what does that feel like? Where else do you feel that sensation, and what does that sensation feel like? And it's really difficult to put into words. Now, here's kind of a word trap, because anxious can also mean excited. It can mean anticipatory. And I've used the example, you've heard it before if you've watched any of my other videos, when I talked about getting on a roller coaster. I mentioned that I got almost into a panic state thinking about getting on a roller coaster down at Cedar Point. And then a few short years later, I go get on one and didn't want to get off. I kept going back around and getting back on the roller coasters at SeaWorld. Now, how does that happen? What changed? Something very simple. And we're going to talk about that some more as we go on. But I want to help us kind of drill down on what exactly is depression, what exactly is anxiety, and what exactly are emotions. We feel these things, and often think about your own experience. This is probably going to be the better way to describe this. When there's something that you don't like. It's a behavior that somebody else does. Sometimes it's even a behavior that we do. Or something happens. We're instantly in a mood, and in that mood might last for a few days. That mood or that state can be an underlying action that is happening inside the brain that is activating the cortisol and the adrenal response, because we start to simmer or stew over something that made us angry or something that is making us somewhat fearful, maybe even a little bit avoidant. Now, if you consume a lot of news, people get really agitated around the news, and the first thing that they tell me is I get really anxious. I start to ask specifically, what kinds of activities do you participate in? What does your day look like? And you might be thinking to yourself, well, Kelly, they just told you they're anxious. Yes, but now we've got to look at what triggered that state. Because anxious and depressive are moods and states. These are not emotions. What they are is they're kind of an encapsulating way of describing an event, something that touched a value in us or a belief, and it challenged that. Now, sometimes it challenges it in a good way, sometimes not so good. And so that's why we're talking about how emotions are made today. Now, I'm going to talk for just a second about something else. So both Dr. Anderson and Dr. Ledoux are considered the premier guys to turn to when it comes to emotion. Now, something that you haven't heard me talk about is love. You know what love feels like. You know how good it feels when a person you really deeply care about comes into the room. Maybe the scent of them, the touch of them, the way they look at you, the way they hold you. You know what that feels like. Love. Remember I said there were 2 more out there? Well, that's the thing. We can also be in a state of love. And I can already hear the objections. Come on, Kelly, seriously? A state of love? Yes. For the first 18 months that you are in a new relationship with a new partner, you experience feel good chemicals. Your body is electrified. All kinds of things are happening because your body is trying to mirror up and is trying to mirror up with the person that you are finding most attractive. And so your body is doing a lot of things hormonally in order to help you with that attraction and to solidify that attraction. So when we talk about the emotion of love, and I love that this is what Joe Ledoux says in chapter 1 to start his chapter of his book, The Emotional Brain, The Mysterious Underpinnings of Emotional Life. Quote, "Our civilization is still in a middle stage, scarcely beast, in that it is no longer guided by instinct, scarcely human, in that it is yet not wholly guided by reason." This is Theodore Dreiser writing in Sister Carrie. Joe goes on to talk about in the first chapter kind of how he came to the understanding that it's really hard to find emotions in the brain. So, and as he talks about it, he on page 12 says, quote, "I view emotions as biological functions of the nervous system. I believe that figuring out how emotions are represented in the brain can help us understand them. This approach contrasts sharply with the more typical one in which emotions are studied as psychological states." Here's that word again. Independent of the underlying brain mechanisms. Psychological research has been extremely valuable, but an approach where emotions are studied as brain functions is far more powerful. Now, Joe's been doing this a long time. There's a lot of really good research that he's done looking at rats. And I know if you follow Jordan Peterson at all, you've probably heard that about rats and their hierarchy and their cultural system. Cultural systems have a lot to do with how we integrate and how we navigate our world. Also has a lot to do with basically how we experience ourselves and how we experience other people. So here's where it starts to get complicated though. So if I go into Dave Anderson's book, How Emotions Guide Us, here's what you need to know. He talks about how emotions like fear, aggression, and love are sensors. There's something that is innately in the body. And again, he studies fruit flies, which I think is fascinating because I don't know how fruit flies have emotions, but there must be something to it. And I'm going to read something to you and you tell me if this sounds familiar. And then I'm going to challenge you around this. I'm on page 8 of his book. He's talking about Darwin's book from 1872 called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animal. It says, "Even insects express anger, terror, jealousy, and love by the stridulation or the rubbing their wings together to produce sound." We know that animals feel something, and I think that sometimes we assign human emotion to animals because we think that we understand them and we think that they kind of function the same way that we do. That's an intrinsic bias. But there might actually be something to that. Science is still definitely looking that over. He also says Darwin's assumption was fine for his purpose because the assumption was that animals feel the way we do. He says, which was to explain the evolutionary benefit of specific emotional behaviors that people and some animals share, like why our eyes widen when we're afraid. However, for a hard-nosed neuroscientist like me, the assumption is problematic for several reasons. First, if we define emotions as feelings, then as Tinbergen said, we can't objectively know if an animal has any emotions at all. Second, if we simply assume, like Darwin, that all animals have emotions, then in order to infer what kind of emotion a given creature is feeling, we have to attribute to that animal the same emotions we would feel under similar circumstances. But animals are not little people in furry costumes, and so our intuition may mislead us. So he goes on to talk about some examples of this. And as he goes on, he also does a really good job of talking about fear states and how people enter fight or flight. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the weeds on that tonight, but I'm going to talk to you about emotional control. This is a perplexing thing for people because we like to tell ourselves, I can't control my emotions. Yes, you can. And I think that's new for a lot of people. And I'm going to digress for just a second because I'm going to share something else with you. So, looking at Ekman's page on how emotions are triggered, he talks about the event, our physiological state, and basically, I'm going to read this because this is really important for you to understand. When an emotion is triggered, there are three parts. The event, the first part that most of us think of, is the event in the world. As an example, let's say I'm walking down the street and I run into an old friend. So that's the first part of an emotion. It's the event. The event could also be me at home that night remembering that I ran into this old friend and that he could once again trigger that emotion. Two is our physiological state. Then there's part two of the emotion, and that has to do with our physiological state. So when I was walking down the street, was I tired or hungry? Was I already dealing with a mood I had earlier in the day? Pay attention to that because this is really important. For example, maybe I was frustrated earlier in the day, which will color and shift how I experience this person I'm running into. Sometimes we become emotional just because of the event, running into someone. But sometimes our emotion and the way that we become emotional is triggered by what's going on in the context of our body and what has happened to us earlier in that day. That is key. Now, the third part, our emotional database. Part three is an emotion is the biggest part. The third part of an emotion trigger is what's called a database. The database is like a storehouse with all of our old stories and scripts. Some of these we may have learned from our parents, our communities, and our interactions with the world. And some of them might be specific to the event. So, if, for example, running into an old friend on the street, my database could include many stories and experiences with this friend, but it could also include stories that are older stories. Some example could be a story of, quote, wow, I'm not good at keeping in touch, or I'm a bad friend. Or the story could be, nobody cares about me the way I care about them. If this friend hasn't reached out to me in years, I could easily forget that I also haven't reached out. Our database influences how we respond to the event. And then he says in the next paragraph, we start to understand that our emotions are our responsibility, not just what happened to us. So I think you can see how very quickly we have a lot more control of our emotions than we like to think. And when I sit with clients come in and say, I don't know how to control what I feel. That's because nobody showed you. And, if you followed my subconscious series, you know that the subconscious is kind of the storehouse of some of those experiences. And it's also kind of how we go back and forth between the front of the brain and the back of the brain to access experiences, to forecast experiences, and then to create new experiences and to overwrite some of the old stuff that was lingering that told us this is what a fear is. Hence my fear of getting on a roller coaster. I don't have that physiological state. I don't have that emotional state, the fear, and I certainly don't have anxiety. What I have, depending on the day, depending on the time, depending on what I'm eating, depending on how much sleep I've had the night before, is I have experiences throughout the day that tap into that reticular activation system and my amygdala alert system to say, here we are. How are we going to interpret this fun today? Now, I'm going to share with you something really quickly because as I had been preparing to do this, one of the things that I was doing to distract myself to kind of freshen my mind so that I'm not looking at things through the same lens was I watched a video and somehow it became about turning tragedy into a competition. And you might be thinking, Kelly, that's just ridiculous. Why would anybody do that? Here's why. Because when we go into survival mode, the brain is brilliant at figuring out ways to get us through to the other side. Now, if you recall, when I talked to you about the first time that I got shot at, kid with a rifle up on a hill, up at Oak Hill Cemetery shooting at my patrol car. Now, because I had already mentally rehearsed how to respond to shots fired at me, I didn't go into a state of fear or flight, but I did go into a state of fight because I was ready to challenge that kid, and then I did. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, Kelly, how do I make that work for me? A couple of things. So one of the things about emotion that you need to pay attention to is that there's often a thought that precedes the emotion. Now, I'm kind of borrowing from some early predecessors, the guys who created cognitive behavior therapy. Now, you need to understand there are a lot of different kinds of cognitive behavior therapy. And if we get to Ellis, we talk about rational emotive behavior therapy, or RET. In RET, he describes something very eloquently. We have a thought, we have an emotion a quadrillionth of a second later, and then we have a behavior that's attached to that. Well, we can't intercept between the thought and the emotion, but we can change the behavior. But here's the interesting paradigm. And I don't know that he didn't know this or if it's something that neuroscience discovered after this theory was created, but we actually can intercept between the thought and the emotion. And it's all how we view the thought. How are we interpreting that thought? Because we actually assign the emotions based on past experience, based on current experience, and based on current state, whatever our mood is at that time. So I realize I'm kind of throwing a lot at you, and I'm imagining that it feels a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. The long and the short of it is this. I want you to imagine that you've had a bad day. You come home, you sit down, what's the first thing you do? Some people turn on the television. Other people put on music. Yet again, some people will go in, change their clothes, get into something comfy, maybe go work out. And then you got those people who will want to go and talk to somebody. They may be calling somebody on the phone, trying to process what's happening through their day. And I'm going to talk to you just for a moment. You're going to hear this a lot throughout this series because it's really important that you understand how to manage big emotions. One of those things is just what I asked you towards the beginning of this video. What do you feel? Where do you feel it? Because once we locate that, and obviously the feelings that we're assigning, we can have 10,000 descriptions for something. But here's why that's important, because how we give it context is how we also navigate it. Because remember, I told you about turning something tragic into a competition. There was a movie about two ice climbers. They were up on a mountain in the Andes, into the void. The one guy slipped and fell, shattered his leg, and then his buddy had to cut him loose, even though they were tethered, trying to belay themselves down off of a 21,000-foot peak. But what did the guy who was cut loose do? He made it a game. He said, I bet I can get 20 meters, and I bet I can do it in 18 minutes. And then he would move himself as best that he could, in doing a lot more damage, I'm sure, along the way, but scooting along on his bottom on the snow, moving himself along, and just trying to get faster and faster and faster, because the sooner he could get to help, the better. Now, it didn't go amazingly well. He did survive. The real point of this story, though, is this is what Navy SEALs do. This is what special operators do. They figure out how to get through the next few minutes. I love that they call it Gogginsing, because when you are Gogginsing, I'll say that 10 times fast. When you're doing this, what you're doing is you are overcoming that specific emotional pain that you have assigned a value of deep emotional distress to. You're overriding that and saying no, because when I get to the other side, hear the transition there. No, because. Now comes the belief. Once I get to the other side, I get to rest, I get to take on water, and I get to just be not doing this anymore. So this is why I love it when clients walk in and say to me, I just don't want any more of this. And I say, well, define this for me. Because once they tell me what this is, then we write it down. And then once we write that down, I ask them, where do you feel this in your body? Now, I know I've said that over and over and over again, and you're going, all right, Kelly, why do you keep asking, where do I feel that in my body? A good therapeutic technique is to locate where you feel something as a bodily sensation. A guy named Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Now, if you've ever heard Bessel, he's very smart, very good psychiatrist. What he recognized is that trauma gets stored in the body. We're only just now understanding the way that this gets stored in the body. Brain scans demonstrate that the brain structure changes as a result of trauma, but it can be healed. And part of the way that it gets healed is releasing that trauma. Now, Chase Hughes does a very different version of releasing the trauma than, say, Marissa Peer, who's a hypnotherapist, versus Bessel van der Kolk, and even different than the way that Marsha Linehan delivers dialectical behavior therapy with people who do borderline behaviors. Now, notice I said do borderline behaviors. You don't have borderline behaviors, you do those behaviors. And when you hear me talk about mental health, I really don't like the term mental health because it's really nebulous. In truth, it's the mental fitness. And here's why I say it's the mental fitness, because ultimately what we're trying to do is work that muscle of control. So I'm going to borrow from 1924, and then I'm going to finish that thought. So reading from the Applied Psychology book by Dr. Ure, page 209, chapter 9, Control of Emotion, Emotional Traits, the Problem of Control. The educational problems of regulating emotion are quite as genuine as those of improving intellectual efficiency. And you told me we couldn't improve. How thoroughly life is pervaded with feeling and how tragically it may be overcome by inner storm and stress. It takes no very profound reflection to see the simple pleasantness and unpleasantness of experience, the various forms of emotion, and the more permanent traits called mood, sentiment, and temperament make a pattern upon the surface of life like the sunshine and shadow in a landscape. Joy and sorrow, love and hatred, courage and fear, hope and despair, anger, envy, jealousy, pride, shame, remorse, sympathy, pity, curiosity, admiration, awe, reverence. These and many other emotions are among the most frequent incidents of daily life. It was a whole lot more than 9, wasn't it, Kelly? Yes, it was. Reason why? Because what he's also describing are states and moods that are often in attendance with both emotions and feelings. Now, here's a problem, and I'm going to try to keep this first video kind of short because there's a lot of material here, and there's a lot for you to think about. But don't despair. There's 2 more parts coming, and don't worry, I'm not going to belabor the point. When we are having a sensation, or as he said, some are so subtle and transitory as to elude observation, others are tumultuous and powerful. What he's talking about is sometimes what we feel, if we're emotionally well adjusted, we navigate through virtually all of those at some point throughout our day or at least throughout our week. But if we're not emotionally adjusted, we tend to live between feeling something that makes us feel uncertain about the future. This is where people say, I'm anxious. Or they're feeling very sad, very low mood. You know those people that you look at them and they're like Eeyore? Okay, Pooh, whatever you say, Pooh. So I worked with a guy recently who, second session, I had already I went way too fast with this guy, but the point of going this fast was because he had 3 sessions with me under his EAP. So the first thing that I did is I drilled down on, it strikes me that you seem to experience low mood pretty regularly. Tell me about that. And when I said that, he said, well, as far back as I can remember, geez, I think I was in the 2nd grade or 1st grade or I don't know, sometime during elementary school. He said, I started to look at my dad. I started to look at the way that I was living, and I realized I'm never going to be as good as he is. And I said, where did you hear that message? And he said, I don't know. He said, but then I got older and I got into a graduate school. And he said, I got into this program. He said, I was kind of smart. I was good at taking tests, but I really wasn't that good at what I was doing. And it really wasn't, like the passion of my life. And he said, and then I started to get to a point where just every day was like the next, and I just didn't feel emotionally well. And I said, explain to me emotionally well. Now, see, I think you can already hear this is somebody who has perceived that he's not going to be as good as his dad. So how did he start out life? Where did he hear that? A couple of days ago, he told me, I think I heard that from a teacher. Can't be certain. And that's not really the point. The fact is, it made enough of an impression on him. And by the way, he followed his father into his father's business. So I too followed my dad into my father's business. My dad was a police officer. I was a police officer. And if you've heard me either at Severed Conscience with Z and O, or if you've heard me on any of my other episodes here, I've talked about the fact that I think I was an okay police officer. I don't think I was great. I was super passionate about it, almost to the point of overdoing it because I wanted to be perfect. I wanted so badly to be as good as my dad. And then somebody very smartly said to me, you know, you're not your dad. And you know, he's not even here. He's 3,000 miles away. He has no idea whether you're any good or not. And he's proud of you anyway. But see, it was challenging that belief system because remember what I told you earlier about intercepting between the thought and the emotion. You have to approach the belief system. And if you just watched my subconscious series, you know this is where the belief system resides. So what we have to do in order to control the emotions is we need to start to get that handle on what do I believe? Now, it takes some time to uncover the belief. And thankfully, sitting with most clients, I can get there with them within at least 2, sometimes 3 sessions. Now, I'll be honest with you though, I had a client that I treated for better than 6 months before I finally got to a place where I understood what he was trying to tell me. Because in his lack of articulation, and it wasn't that he's doing anything wrong, wasn't that he was treatment resistant, it's that he was struggling to figure out where these things were coming from. And I think there was a part of him that had probably sequestered some of those experiences as a self-preservation thing, which is appropriate because sometimes things hurt. Sometimes we hear things that make us feel really useless, not good enough, and we're never going to measure up. So once we identify those things and we begin to approach them from the standpoint of, wait a minute, is any of that even true? You know, what about these areas where I feel really good? Because one of the questions that I also ask, and I invite you to ask yourself the same thing is, when is that low mood or that anxious thought and mood not here? What does that feel like? What time of day is that? What am I doing when I feel good? Because it's kind of the never and always. We're never always feeling something like depressive or anxious thoughts and moods. But we do feel sometimes low. For example, 2 weeks ago, my mom went into assisted living. I think I told you in the very first video that my mom has dementia, and I was her primary caregiver the last 6 years. Well, here's the thing. Anxiety, when people are doing anxious behaviors, they're very contagious. You can feel it. Here's the other thing. My sister, yesterday, Sunday, I walk up behind her because I see that she's up front praying. And I go up and I put my hand on her. Another gentleman came and put his hand on me. And it hit me like a wave, the sadness. It was so overwhelming. I tried to fight back tears and I couldn't do it. And what that is, there's a powerful thing that happens when several people are in a closed space. Now, we're in my church, you know, it's a pretty good sized church. But you can feel the sadness of the people who are mourning. They're low, they're hurting. All of that emotion, you could feel that. And I tried to stifle it. Bad move. I don't recommend it. But I did it because I thought I needed to be strong for my sister. When I walked away from her after we were done praying, I walked out to blow my nose. And when I got out into the narthex, I realized, feel what you feel, locate it. I felt it right here. It just hurt my heart. There were quite a few people at that altar call. There are 2 families that are really going through some tough stuff. You could feel it. So if you've ever been to a movie theater and the music is just right, the action is just impeccably timed to the music, suddenly you're swept up in the emotion of what you're seeing, that's what that experience is. You and all of those people in that movie theater are sharing in that emotional experience, just as the people who are acting and who are evoking those emotional responses from you. So this is my invitation to you also. Experiment with this a little bit. But we're also going to talk a little bit about, in the next video, kind of how we recognize what we're feeling, but also how we label it. And you recall that at the top I told you there's some challenges here. People are challenging what Darwin had to say. People are also challenging Mr. Ledoux and Mr. Anderson. But the reasons that they're challenging them is maybe because we started out with a faulty premise to begin with. And I've noticed this across a few other disciplines. Now, this isn't to take anything away from Mr. Ledoux or Mr. Anderson. These are well respected researchers. Their work is very good. So I'm not being critical of them. What I'm saying is if we start with a particular set of principles in mind, only to find out later those principles were based on something erroneous, we relook at them. At least we should. And that's what Lisa Feldman Barrett did with her work. Now, there are some neuroscientists that she calls out in her book, which I appreciate because I think we owe it to ourselves to be intellectually honest about what do I feel. And then I'm going to tell you this. Going back to the applied psychology, he says, and he's talking about superficial modifications of consciousness. He says their function in life is twofold. First and foremost, they're a means of adjusting the organism to the environment, a source of energy and a means of protection. Some of them, as love, ambition, curiosity, and anger, are the major motives of human affairs. We're going to talk a little bit about motives as well. Many seem to be the conscious aspect of those instinctive tendencies towards self-preservation and the development of family and social life, which are fundamental conditions of the existence of the race. No mere accidents are they, but rather essential parts of the evolutionary mechanism by which nature has carried out its mysterious purposes in the domain of living creatures. He talks a little bit more about why we have these emotions and what their purpose is. But I hope that you also picked up on the fact that he's talking about the social and the cultural aspects of emotion. When I hear bagpipes, I'm tuned in. When I see somebody in a kilt, I'm tuned in. When I'm wearing a kilt, I'm tuned in. I'm kidding. But seriously, when we think about where do we give importance, we also have an emotional bias toward those things that we give importance. Now, over the years, my emotional bias has shifted from some things, not so much culturally, as much as my internal views of self around my culture, because the more that I have found out about my culture, it enriches me. But it enriches me in a way that ties to an emotional set of responses to something that I fully acknowledge may be a false history. Yeah, try that one on. All right, so that's where we're at today, talking about emotions. So stay tuned for the next part because we're going to do a little bit deeper dive into what emotions are and how they inform us. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the ways that we can begin to manage some of those bigger emotions. Again, let me recap. What do I feel? Where do I feel it in my body? How am I identifying this? And when I say, how am I identifying this, think about what does it mean to me to have this feeling? What is the experience that's happening around me? How am I interpreting that experience? And what do I need to do next? This is how we begin to take control of our emotions. This is also how we begin to reframe our bodies and our minds away from something that was once negative. If you watch BJ Fogg talk about micro habits, I love that he does this. He looks at what is your motivation? Is it above or below the axis line? Well, once you figured out, and I thought about this with my boat, I got a 42-foot boat that I can't seem to get around to going out and working on. It's because the motivation isn't as high simply because I live in Michigan and sometimes the weather's just cold. It's crap. And I don't really have a place to work on it. So, when you think about that, you're like, not today. But think about this in terms of more simple things. Working out, the way that you eat, the people that you spend time with, and how you consume media. So we can also orient away from things that are called addictions. I really don't like that word because they're basically behaviors that we do that serve a function. And guess what? That function is rooted in emotion. So till next time, lads and lasses, I'll see you on the other side.